Books then, wagon load after wagon load, brought to the frontier an ocean of words. The American historian Daniel Borstein estimates that the frontier needed between 1 and 3 million things to be named. The frontier was ready for a flood of names and words, from rocks to bugs, from towns to rivers to new ideas. The West was about to be baptized with words. Language was coming. Language was coming by the wagon load, by the boat road, by the boatload of knowledge. It was from these wagon loads of language that Lincoln's education came to him. Wagon loads of people who carried with it those same three ideas: God, education, and community. Mostly for them, it was all in one book, the Bible, but sheer language itself, for Abe, became his Harvard and his Yale. He never got to Jackson and Illinois College. He heard from the Bible from his mother, night after night. School, when he got to it, was called blab school, because everyone was to recite their lessons out loud and simultaneously to show that they were learning. It was language by immersion, and Lincoln loved language. He formed letters in the dirt. He read by candle or fire and made notes in charcoal on a shovel and then blew them away for more. Everybody who knew him knew that words and books held a strange fascination for him. No doubt it is a folk tale that he read every book within 50 miles of Pigeon Creek. That would have included all the books in New Harmony. One historian suggests that Lincoln knew there was a school with lots of books in New Harmony, which he would have coveted. The Harmonists, as we have noted, used the main road from Harmony to the state capital at Corydon, a trail that passed right through Little Pigeon. Lincoln would have seen these strange, devout Germans from the time he was 7 until he was 15, 8 years later, when they moved on. But the Owenites' belief in communal society, religious infidelity, radical theories of marriage and family, and education, all in a Scottish or a French accent, would have found little favor in the settlement the Lincolns lived in. But we can see also that Owen's ideas of radical Scottish democracy came through to Lincoln eventually through the works of Jefferson and John Locke. Now, it is estimated that in Pigeon Creek, Lincoln was surrounded by at least 750 books, there being 3 men alone who had over 100 books in their libraries. His love for reading gave him a false reputation for being lazy, and also seems to have frustrated his sometimes violent father a good deal. Lincoln often mentioned that his ambition was not to ever have to be a laborer again. It was language he loved. One neighbor said of him, "Abe was awful lazy. He worked for me, was always reading and thinking. Used to get mad at him. He would laugh and talk and crack jokes and tell stories all the time." Others said he spoke little while working, but when a break came, he would tell some yarn that he had heard, mostly something funny, always something interesting. He loved words and letters and things like the letters of his own name. He wrote a poem about his name. "Abraham Lincoln is my name, and with my pen I wrote the same. I wrote it in both haste and speed and left it here for fools to read." He liked, as Carl Sandburg says, being ridiculous. But he was also solemn. Abraham Lincoln, his hand and pen. He will be good, but God knows when. And he once said to a friend, "A-B-E, Abe, that stands for me. Don't look a blame bit like me. Ha, ha, ha." Lincoln was learning from the oceans and rivers of language around and about him, and he was finding something to express in language. Remember the first part of our definition of language, knowing something and then having something to say. To young Lincoln, language, words, both written and spoken, was life itself. He could hardly stop himself from speaking first when a stranger rode up to the fence of the family settlement. For that eager outburst, he was severely cuffed, knocked down by his father for the wrong of speaking first before his father. But he could not suppress the flow of words that were coming out of him, given the way that life was welcoming him with words. It was as if the land itself grew language. Words grew like corn stalks. Words appeared like clouds of pigeons darkening the sky. Language was like creek water over a naked boy's body. Language was like the silence of the starry, starry night. And then a lifeline into that silence, his mother's Bible-speaking voice. The frontier days of Lincoln were a time when the horizon's amber waves of grain seemed to carry along wagon loads of people, people who held within them that Mayflower language of faith in God, Bible words for learning, virtue, and a hope for a new world. The frontier days of Lincoln were when words for those three awakened ideas, faith, virtue, and community, came west, and he took them in. And then he would let them out, express them in new ways. Lincoln was an outstanding poet. He carried with him a volume of the poetry always of Robert Burns. He was never far from a volume of Shakespeare. Lincoln used to say that he preferred the Shakespeare plays that he could see in his own mind's eye than the ones he'd later witness on stage. Words, then, were deep visions for him. Much of this language he committed to memory. Once something was in Lincoln's mind, it held fast and he never lost it. He had an iron grip on his mind. He would work very hard to reach a word, to commit a passage to memory, or even just to plumb the depths of a thought. He spent months reading Euclid until he mastered his logic. He would sometimes curl up his 6'4" frame into a tight ball on the floor of his law office and hold his knees up to his chest in a compression of creativity until the right word, the only word, would come to him. His partner, William Herndon, was amazed to find him doing this. Lincoln rarely wanted to speak without a manuscript. That's why I love him so much. He wrote multiple drafts of every talk, including the Gettysburg Address. All was most carefully done. Like any poet, his heart was a fiery forge, his mind a working billows, and his tongue and pen an anvil and hammer. Let us turn to some examples and stories of young Lincoln encountering language. Language seems to emerge as an immersion experience. The Indiana historian, Lewis A. Warren, who's also a Protestant minister, has collected some remarkable tales about young Lincoln over there in Pigeon Creek at play in the fields of the Lord. Of course, immersion in language requires people, other people, community. Lincoln had an abundance of playmates and their parents, as well as a parade of teachers. It is a misleading myth that frontier people were rugged individualists. As brave folks as they were, nobody made it alone. The first Lincoln log cabin was raised by a cohort of neighbors. Once the little family had survived the winter in nothing more than a lean-to. Within a mile radius of the Lincolns, there lived 9 families, with a total of 49 children, 15 boys and 13 girls under 7 years of age, and 12 boys and 9 girls between 7 and 17. Within a 4-mile radius, there was a total of 90 kids under 7 years of age, 45 boys and 45 girls, and another 48 children between the ages of 7 and 17. In 1820, when Abe was 11, there were at least 40 families within a 5-mile radius of their cabin. Now, the content of the books that were available to Abraham and his friends is mighty interesting for several reasons. One is the high moral content of the lessons. There were psalm-quoting readers. There was Benjamin Franklin's self-praising autobiography reporting on his own virtuous ways of living. One of the readers that Lincoln read had actually been printed by Benjamin Franklin. Little did he know. And then there was Weems's biography of George Washington with his famous story of honesty and the cherry tree. That story, if nothing else, formed the keystone of the moral arc of honesty that Abraham Lincoln built and maintained his entire life. It is impossible to be cynical about Lincoln's honesty. But there was an out loud theme to these lessons, and Lincoln made the most of it. Talk, speech, rhetoric, language spoken and heard, breaking the silence of the prairie. Perhaps the most significant book of all was Murray's English Reader. Lincoln told his lawyer partner Herndon that that book was the best school book ever put into the hands of an American youth. It is about two things: morality and living language. For example, it includes a section called The Public Speeches, including a speech by Cicero against Verres, a speech by St. Paul in defense of Festus and Agrippa. Lincoln would learn these, and then he would disclaim them himself before family and friends. Sandberg pictures for us Lincoln standing on a tree stump giving speeches to his friends, and if not to friends, then to just other trees. Lincoln was also taken to church, some as a child, and language was alive in sermons. His father had supervised the construction of the local Separatist Baptist meeting house and probably had built the pulpit himself, and Abe may have even helped. Abe was famous, if not infamous, for then mimicking the preacher to his friends later. He was remarkably able to remember what the preacher had said and was an excellent comic actor portraying the preacher himself. More on that later. Murray's English Reader was a book to be read out loud. We have already mentioned Blab School, and the stated purpose of that book was to improve youth in the art of reading out loud, to ameliorate their language and sentiments, to inculcate some of the important principles of piety and virtue. In other words, 2 out of the 3 purposes of that book was just about language itself. The third was about the content of language, virtue. The introduction goes on to say that the book will deal with, he's a little boy reading this, deal with the principles of good reading out loud. I'm afraid to do this because you'll be thinking, how am I doing this? Proper loudness of voice, distinctness, due degree of slowness, propriety of pronunciation, how am I doing? Emphasis, tone, pauses, and manner of reading verse. Lincoln was learning language as a living and a heard and shared thing.